Okay, so we're going to have a little look at post-industrial Britain then. We talked about pre-industrial Britain being kind of pre-1800s. Post-industrial Britain, you should be looking for 1850 onwards. So you can see there we lost 50 years. Obviously, we talked about in pre-industrial Britain how Britain was agricultural. People lived in small towns and villages. All the work was kind of farms and small cottage industries. And we started to get some technological advancements in Britain, and ultimately the development of large factories from which kind of towns and cities, larger towns and cities started to develop. And what happened is the lower classes migrated from the towns and villages to these larger cities as a result of the promise of work. You know, it was this new exciting opportunity for them, and obviously that led to urbanisation. But what actually happened was we got a huge number of people living in these cities, and the cities just were simply not ready for this influx of migration of people. So we had severe overcrowding, we had no sewage systems set up, so we ended up with widespread diseases. I mean, these factories were really bleak places to work. For the lower classes, they were working incredibly long hours. We talked about the 666. So we described the lower classes as being slaves to the factories. We'd gone from kind of around 42 bank holidays a year, when we know sport provides opportunities for sports, festivals, wakes, fairs, to around 4. So they were significantly reduced. And this was said to be a really bleak time for sport. We've seen a lot of changes in society. We've seen the emergence of a new class in the middle class. We've seen the introduction of things like the Metropolitan Police Force, the RSPCA, and we've seen a real decline in sports involvement and leisure opportunities between 1800s and 1850. After which point, though, Britain was undergoing a civilising process and things started to improve. We're going to go through our gloats again, look at how things improved, and look, more importantly for us, at the impact that that had on sporting involvement and leisure opportunities in Britain. Okay, so I mean, if we're having a little look at the sheet, they've given us the A3 sheet. Types of activities now. We had bait and sports earlier, where we'd be talking in post-industrial Britain how they'd been banned. I mean, they'd been banned in 1835. We talk about the introduction of, yes, we had real tennis in pre-industrial Britain. Now we got the introduction of lawn tennis in post-industrial Britain, which is incredibly important for us, particularly when we get to gender. We had the mob football, had now changed to association football. We still had cricket, but we started to get touring sides, county cricket, and eventually international fixtures and tours of Australia. We talk about pedestrianism changing to athletics. And lots of other activities we could discuss, and we might do some examples as we go through. Okay, so let's get started then. So our first one, our G, is for gender. The most important thing to know about opportunities for women in post-industrial Britain was initially opportunities were incredibly restricted. We know we talked about in pre-industrial Britain how upper-class women were playing sophisticated sports. They were playing hawking and archery. However, in post-industrial Britain, opportunities really decreased for women. It was thought to be medically harmful, could impact on their fertility. That women were, there was perceived physical inferiority of women, and it was said that sport would be too strenuous. Also, we had a strict Victorian ethos. We can see the outfits being worn by the ladies here at the side. Women had these large clothing, these large dresses on, very restrictive. It was thought inappropriate for women to sweat in public. They couldn't show their bodies. So opportunities were very, very limited. However, we talk then about the introduction of lawn tennis, which developed in the 1870s. Lawn tennis led to the emancipation of women in sport. Women started to have increased rights in society. We'd seen the education of females, the introduction of the girls' public schools, and women's involvement in tennis. I mean, I think you could argue positives and negatives of how tennis kind of provided equality for women, because yes, women could participate. However, they could participate because actually tennis wasn't really seen as a sport. Tennis was seen to be a social activity. Yes, women could participate. However, it was done in the privacy of gardens. It was thought to be relatively non-vigorous. So, it did provide more opportunities for women, but wasn't reflective of equality. Women's championship was introduced into Wimbledon in 1884. However, the women were not allowed women's singles. Championships didn't start until after the men's singles had finished. So again, it was kind of a second class note, really. However, they did have some really significant role models, ladies like Lottie Dodd, 5-time Wimbledon champion, won her first Wimbledon championship in 1887, at the age of 15. She went on to win 4 more Wimbledon championships, and in her 5 years at Wimbledon, she only actually dropped 1 set, and she was from Cheshire. So Lottie Dodd is a really significant role model for females. Another reason women could play lawn tennis, I forgot to mention to you before, it was mixed gender. So I said it was an opportunity for women and men to socialise. I think I did mention socialising. Okay, so that was incredibly influential. We mentioned the schools as well. Girls' public schools opened, and the female headmistresses, reforming female headmistresses, want to provide opportunities for women to participate in sport and activities as well. So women in the public schools would have participated in things like lacrosse, hockey, eventually netball, lawn tennis, as long as the activities were perceived to be feminine and not too physical. Okay, so that's a little bit about gender. Literacy in education. Well, we know there were significant increases in literacy and education throughout post-industrial Britain. We know in pre-industrial Britain there'd been a widespread illiteracy amongst the lower classes. However, in post-industrial Britain we had the introduction of the Forced Education Act in 1870, before which the education of the lower classes had been a church responsibility, and now we had the introduction of state schools. We've talked in our very first video about the fact that literacy impacted on codification. It also impacted on your access to certain sports. So as education and literacy improved throughout Britain, we've seen increased codification of sports and regulation of sports. The public schools are incredibly influential, and we're going to do a video on them. The ex-public school boys we know came out of the schools. We had the first melting pot in the public schools. The boys came out, went to their universities. We had the university melting pot. And then the boys left the universities and formed national governing bodies and codified sports. An example there for you is the FA in 1863. You can use the RFU, you can use the LTA, you can use the AAA. So lots of sport and national governing body examples you can use. The upper class, because they were more literate than the lower classes, they could access complex sports with written rules, where for the lower classes, although they were starting to be educated, initially it was only children around 8 years old going to schools, because for the lower classes it wasn't seen as being as relevant. Still, their priority would have been to be at work in the factories and bringing in money for their families. But we did eventually see a rise in media interest in sports as well. We'll have had newspapers writing about sport and events, and then we've seen the rise of sport and heroes and sports stars like W.G. Grace, which we'll come to. Law and order then, so as we move on. Law and order increased. I described Britain as undergoing the civilising process earlier on in the video. We had the introduction of the Metropolitan Police in 1829, the RSPCA 1824, and this led to an increased control, regulation of society. As to sport affects society, if we regulate society, there's increased regulation of sport. We've seen gambling being controlled. We've seen the banning of the bait in sports. We've seen rule changes. You see the Queensberry rules being published in 1867 in boxing, led to the introduction of things like boxing gloves. So lots of rules were introduced. This also allowed for sports to be spread across Britain and across the empire, because everybody had a standardised set of rules to participate from. And it also sought to reduce the violence seen in the sports and make them more respectable. We know our gentlemen amateurs believed in muscular Christianity, in athleticism, so they wouldn't have wanted to be involved in sports that were brutal and violent, and not sophisticated or civilised. Okay. In terms of time then, so availability of time to start off with. In terms of time, I said to you how the lower classes worked the 666 initially. So they were slaves to the factories, they had very little leisure time and therefore very little opportunities. Where in pre-industrial Britain, we know there'd been lots of bank holidays, plenty of wakes and fairs and festivals when activities would have been put on. And there was also, obviously, their work was agricultural, so they were outdoors, they were active all the time, whereas now there was real ill health. They were slaves working these long hours in the factories indoors, cramped conditions, lots of smog and pollution in the major cities as well. So it was important that they were given leisure time and opportunities to participate. So we've seen a reduction eventually in the working hours. We've seen things like the introduction of the Saturday half day, the early closing movement, which was a series of bills passed through Parliament, which aimed to reduce working hours mainly for shop workers, Saturday half day mainly for factory workers, and this provided regular opportunities to participate in sport. If we take the Saturday half day, for example, Saturday half day became a regular, became the time when football games were taking place. And if you look at today, I know we're seeing changes now, the commercialisation and media control of sport, but Saturday, 3 o'clock is still the common time for football, isn't it, in Britain? There was also campaigns for things like the 40-hour week. We know they've been working 72-hour weeks at the start of industrialisation, and this all obviously led to increased leisure time so more people could participate and watch in sport. We also seen paid holidays introduced, and people could go on excursions to the countryside, to the seaside, where they could be cycling and participating in lots of activities like that as well. Okay. So class then, I think actually I'm going for wealth, so availability of, just in time, so it's availability of money now. The upper class and the middle class had all the money. Middle class had been the merchants and traders in pre-industrial Britain, and they'd made a lot of money during the Industrial Revolution. And the upper class and the middle classes used some of that money to develop clubs, to fund sports, we seen the introduction of things like industrial patronage. The lower classes who had less money had less opportunities to participate in sports. They could only participate in sports that required simple kit and equipment. Maybe they had to wait for public facilities to be made available for things like lawn tennis, for swimming, things like the public baths to be introduced. Whereas the upper class could participate in sports that did require specialist kit and equipment, like lawn tennis, where they played in their large gardens, they developed lawn tennis clubs. Also lower classes, we come to this a little bit later on, with amateurs and professionalism, but the lower class also competed as professionals in sport in order to make money. And we've seen the introduction of broken time payments, which again I'll discuss a little bit later. Later on in during the post-industrial Britain, wages for the lower classes increased. They previously lived in poverty. They still lived in relative poverty in comparison to the upper and middle classes, but their life started to improve somewhat. More money means more money available to spend on sport, so they could go and pay to travel to follow their local football team. They could go and watch games on a weekend. Football was incredibly popular amongst the lower classes, and it was actually referred to as the people's game because of its affordability. And we know that's not necessarily the case today. Transport, well, we talked about in Britain how we had started to develop these towns and cities that were kind of making things. So we looked at Sheffield and steel, Stoke and pottery. We look at mining towns and cities that were introduced. London, which was kind of making everything at the time. And so if people are developing things, we obviously then need to transport all this around the world, right, around the country and around the empire. So we've seen lots of technological developments which led to transport revolution in Britain. We'd gone from just having horse and carriages to now roads, bikes, railways, particularly influential. First Manchester to Liverpool Railway was opened in 1830, and obviously this meant people could travel further and faster. They were incredibly affordable. There were different classes of tickets, so a different cost. So the lower class could travel, but the upper class could travel in greater luxury for an increased cost. And this travel led to the introduction of leagues and cup competitions, increased regularity of sport, therefore, because we've got all of these tournaments going on, these leagues running, and also led to the need for increased standardisation. Once we are all travelling to play one another, there is an increasing need to all be playing, therefore, from the same set of rules. We describe this of sport in this particular post-industrial Britain kind of period as moving from being local to now being regional, national, and even international. So we talk about, football, pre-industrial Britain, more football games which were locally significant. Well, now we've got the introduction of the FA. We've got the FA Cup, so people are travelling across the country. We've got international fixtures. The first international fixtures were between the home nations, so England playing Scotland. We see cricket. We see the introduction of touring sides with William Clark 11 to then county cricket, to eventually tours of Australia, which led to the formation of the Ashes. So the railways were incredibly important in the development of sport. Class then, we know that there was the introduction of the middle classes. Middle classes, most important thing to remember about them is they wanted to emulate their social superiors. So they copied the lives of the upper classes. They would have not been accepted by the upper classes, but in lots of instances, they were probably wealthier. The upper class and middle class, who obviously therefore had increased wealth, could invest in sports, which we discussed before. They paid for facilities, they developed rules, they ran national governing bodies, they set up their own teams and leagues, and they competed as amateurs. Amateurs played, remember, for the love. They thought the sport was the reward in itself. They did not believe or nor were they paid. They had their own teams and leagues. I've said there, an example of that might be in football, the Corinthian Casuals. We think today as amateurs being less skillful, less talented than professional players. This was not the case in post-industrial Britain. Lots of these boys here, lots of these men in post-industrial Britain will have been educated in the public schools. They will have been very talented sportsmen. They just didn't believe in payment for play. And in lots of cases, they introduced things like the exclusion clauses to try and ban the lower class professionals. We've seen that in swimming. We've seen that in athletics, for example. And we obviously seen with the rugby union, the split between rugby union and the introduction of rugby league. So we've got the introduction of the two codes now. Because the upper class and the middle class wanted rugby union to remain amateur. However, the lower class needed broken time payments. They needed payment for training and playing if it had them away from work. The upper class point blank refused, and then in 1895 we got the introduction of rugby league, which is associated with the lower class northern towns, and rugby union with the wealthier southern towns in England. It's still the same today. However, rugby union is no longer amateur. It reluctantly accepted professionalism in 1995 as a result of the Paris Declaration. Okay, so the working classes, they worked long hours, they had poor health and lived in poverty at the start of Industrial Revolution. We know things improved. We know that their payments improved, their living conditions improved, they had more free time. So things did improve for the lower classes. They did like to compete in sports as professionals if they had the opportunity. It was a comparatively good job. You could be paid twice as much, for example, being a professional footballer as you could working in the factories. However, it wasn't stable or reliable work. If you were injured, obviously that could be withdrawn. They received broken time payments. If you look at rugby, like we just said, they participated in rugby league and not union. And like we said, it was a good job. If we look at some sports like cricket, both classes played together in cricket. However, the treatment of both amateur and professionals was very, very different. So amateurs will have always been the captain. They will still take in priority kind of positions like the bowlers and batters. They will have changed separately from the lower class professionals, or the lads as they'd call them. They would travel separately, eat separately, but they would still be playing together, sometimes on the same team. The captain of the England team was always an amateur. But obviously they did employ working class professionals if they were talented enough. W.G. Grace is an interesting story. He's here because he's famously described as being a shamateur, because he did receive large payments for playing despite being a gentleman amateur by birth. He was a doctor, actually, by profession. And if we remember, he famously said, "Behave, man, they didn't come to watch you umpire, they came to watch you play on," and they did, which is obviously not in keeping with the gentleman amateur ethos, about playing for the love and the winning not as being as important as the taking part. So that is a really quick overview of post-industrial Britain.